Gonna give folks a minute to hop on. I see all right. Give everyone maybe 2 or 3 minutes to hop on. Good evening, everyone. See more people jumping on. We're 6:01. Give it maybe another minute or so. Good evening. Good evening. Feel free to say hello in the chat. Okay, about one more minute and then we'll get started. Those of you who are logged on, thank you. Hi, Margaret. Thank you for logging on. All right, I think we are about ready to go. If you can't hear me or you have any problems seeing me, feel free to send in a chat and just let me or any of my partners know. But I think we are ready to get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandon Jackson. I am a staff attorney with the Special Projects section of Arch City Defenders. And tonight we are going to host what we are calling ACD Live. This is the final ACD Live. I believe it is the fourth one that we've held virtually. It is live on Deaconess Foundation Facebook page. Also will be shared live on Arch City Defenders Facebook page. So again, thank you everyone for attending. My colleagues will introduce themselves later on in the conversation as it becomes their turn to speak. So let's get started. Tonight, we want to talk to you guys about debtors' prisons in rural Missouri. Again, I'm Brandon Jackson, and let's start by talking a little bit about who I represent, which is Arch City Defenders. Arch City Defenders, as some of you may know, is a holistic legal advocacy organization that combats the criminalization of poverty and state violence, especially in communities of color, but not only in communities of color. ACD's foundation of civil and criminal legal representation, social services, impact litigation, policy and media advocacy, and community collaboration achieves and inspires justice and equitable outcomes for people throughout the St. Louis region and beyond. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that and beyond piece. Next slide, please, Jag. Just to provide a little structure of our conversation tonight, I wanted folks to kind of know how we are going to approach this conversation. So first, we want to talk about Arch City's history of debtors prison litigation. So you can have some institutional context about how we have approached these cases historically, but also we want to provide further context with some facts and figures that we think are relevant. After that, we plan on jumping into the meat of this conversation, so to speak, which is highlighting and discussing, two important cases that we are working on before ending with some final thoughts and answering any questions that you guys may have. So feel free to, put those questions in the chat. You can do that now, or you can wait until the end. With that said, I want to toss it to my colleague, the Director of Advocacy, Jackie Langham.
Thank you, Brandon. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can see me. Please, if you're in the chat, let me know if you're having problems seeing me pop up. I want to talk a little bit about our history of debtors prison, but I also just want to share how excited I am for you to meet the special projects team tonight. They've been doing some really amazing work over the course of the last year since this team kind of started. And they're going to be sharing kind of the fruits of their labor, but I'm also excited to see the potential for this team and the project as we move forward. And Brandon will be talking a little bit about kind of the future for the project. But before we do that, I need to go back in time and want to talk about debtors prisons. Most people learned about Arch City Defenders through the debtors prison work. Those lawsuits, we'll talk about those in a minute, but those lawsuits got a lot of attention, and that's how people became familiar with Arch City Defenders. Those cases came about as a result of our individual representation of clients in municipal courts, and with our attorneys and with volunteers and through a court watch that witnessed what was happening in the municipal courts in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, and recognized that there were problems with the way the courts were operating, that they were unconstitutional, and they were creating debtors prisons. So what is a debtors prison? It is any prison, jail, or other detention facility in which people are incarcerated for their inability, refusal, or failure to pay debt. And a lot of people think that they don't exist anymore. I suspect one of the reasons why is because it was banned under federal law in 1833, but it wasn't until 1983, actually, 150 years later, that the United States Supreme Court finally said that judges cannot send people to jail just because they're too poor to pay court fines. So what we were experiencing in municipal courts is that we saw people who were doing what was called the muni court shuffle, and they were being transferred and transported from court to court to account for the fact that they had warrants out for their arrest and they were unable to pay fines and fees to those courts. So as a result of our work and working with the community, we then started filing lawsuits. And as of today, we have filed 18 debtors prison lawsuits throughout the region since 2014. In 2016, we settled one of the first debtors prison lawsuit cases that we filed. It was a landmark settlement. We settled it for $4.75 million against the city of Jennings. What's also important is that in addition to that settlement amount is the changes that were enacted and that we were able to put into place through our advocacy and our partnerships and through the community's work. In the municipalities where we have challenged debtors prison cases, debtors prisons practices, revenue collected from excessive fines, fees, and jails dropped dramatically by anywhere from 79 to 91% in those municipalities. So we have seen an impact that has resulted from the filing of our lawsuits. Today, there are currently class action cases pending against St. Anne, Edmondson, Ferguson, Florissant, Normandy, and Maplewood. So one of the things that happened after we filed those lawsuits is more people around the region, around the state, around the country, around the world heard about our work and learned about what was happening in Missouri. As a result, we continue to this day to receive applications and request pleas for assistance from throughout the state and throughout the country. And so we recognize that what was happening in our courts in the St. Louis region was and is happening in rural areas of Missouri where there are not as many organizers, there are not as many advocates. And so one of the things that we're doing is we are expanding our work from the St. Louis region and bringing these debtors prison lawsuits throughout Missouri, and namely in rural areas. And you'll hear about two of those cases tonight. But it's just an extension of the work that we're doing. It's also kind of an expansion of the work, and it's really building upon the lessons that we've learned throughout the course of the last almost 12 years as Arch City Defenders has been in the St. Louis community. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to tell you a little bit more about incarceration and detention.
Thank you, Jackie, for that very important kind of institutional history. I think it's important for folks to understand how we have come to participate in this sort of work in our history of doing this. I also think that it is important whenever we talk about folks being jailed for any reason whatsoever, I think we have to talk about that within the context of an unprecedented amount of caging that we are experiencing today in our country. We have over 2 million people locked up in various institutions, as you can see from this pie chart, right? So we see folks in youth detention facilities, we see folks in federal prisons and jails. The largest slice of the pie, so to speak, are state prisons, but the second largest piece are local jails, as you can see there in orange. And so again, I think whenever we talk about debtors prisons or issues around poor folks not being able to get out of jail or bail out, we have to acknowledge the context that we are living in an unprecedented era of mass incarceration. And if you look closely at this pie chart, what you will see is that within that kind of slice of local jails, we see that the great majority of those folks are not convicted, right? And so these are folks who are legally innocent, right? That have been taken from their homes, they've been taken from their families, taken from their jobs. And I just think that it's important to acknowledge that, right? Again, because this is such an unprecedented era that we are living in. If you can go to the next one. This is, focusing on what sort of incarceration drives our national growth in the incarcerated population, right? So we see starting in about the 80s through this chart ends in 2017, what is responsible for the kind of greatest uptick in our incarcerated population are people who are being held pre-conviction, right? So again, these are legally innocent folks, many or most of whom are simply too poor to bond out of jail pending trial. These trends, that we see on the national level continue in some respects when we look at our state, right? So again, we see that largest slice, again, is state prisons, but that second slice is local jails, right? So here, I'm just showing that in some respects, and not all of them, but in some respects, Missouri is consistent with national trends. But in other respects, maybe not so much, right? So here we see incarceration rates with Missouri compared to the US and other countries around the world. And so again, when we talk about this unprecedented era of mass incarceration, we think of the US being the largest jailer in the history of the world. Well, according to the Prison Policy Organization, our state, Missouri, incarcerates per capita more people than the US, right? So again, I think that we have to, whenever we talk about debtors' prisons or anything evolving around this idea of incarceration, we really have to stop and really think about how serious and just how many people are being moved through this system every year. And again, this is just showing that Missouri trends of holding folks pre-trial are consistent with the national trends, right? That the growth in incarceration is primarily people in those local jails. And so we will talk tonight about two cases, both in local jails, two different cases, but we think there's a unifying theme among them. The first case that we will talk about is Hopple versus St. Francis County. For those of you who may not be familiar with St. Francis County is about an hour south of the St. Louis region. My understanding is there's approximately 14,000 people in St. Francis County. And so, you know, obviously this is outside of the St. Louis metropolitan area. And so, you know, our city defenders to this point, as Jackie explained, you know, had done work in local townships, you know, Ferguson, Jennings, et cetera. So how did we come to find out about the St. Francis County Jail? In or about July of 2020, the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit journalism organization, published a piece entitled "Your Local Jail May Be a House of Horrors." This was a staggering piece that detailed a number of alarming things, including the death of Billy Ames, who was a detainee who was originally arrested for violation of a protection order and died while in the custody of St. Francis County Jail in suspicious circumstances. But the article explains Billy Ames, how he came to be jailed in St. Francis County Jail. It explained the very heroic work of a local attorney in the St. Francis community who was fighting back against these things. But it also had stories from other detainees. In fact, the author of the story interviewed over 50 detainees or former detainees, four former staff members, and found things about the jail, you know, things, for example, citing that the jail lost a federal contract in 2017 to house federal detainees because of, you know, rodent and pest infestation and other conditions regarding light in the jail and treatment of the detainees. And it also explained some other things that I think made their way into this lawsuit. And so now, to give you a little bit more about Hopple versus St. Francis County, this is Billy Ames. You're looking at some pictures of him. He was strapped in a chair and kind of left there. And he died in this chair, or a chair that looks just like this. So I want to tell you guys a little bit, or pardon me, I want to pass it to my partner, Katrina Hudson. She's going to explain this lawsuit and give you a little bit more information about it.
Hi, I'm Katrina Hudson. Thank you, Brandon. I am also a staff attorney at Arch City Defenders and a member of the Special Projects team. I am lead counsel on the Hopple v. St. Francis County litigation. We have in this litigation, this is a class action consisting currently of 3 named plaintiffs. The first named plaintiff is a man, 49-year-old man named Robert Hopple. In addition to being targeted and the target of assault by the deputies in the jail, which led to him having some issues with his teeth, having been, he was punched and kicked and abused by other inmates at the request of the deputies, which led to him having some dental problems that went unaddressed. And he had to remove his own teeth from his mouth because he could not get assistance from the medical team at the jail. In addition to that, Rob Hopple talked very vividly about the food conditions in the jail. And I wanted to allow you all to hear in his own words some of that.
When I first got put in there, my cellmate had been there for almost a year. And he was telling me about how the food portions were so small, and most of the time you wouldn't want to eat it because it would either smell wrong or something wasn't right with it, or just wasn't enough. And I was having hunger pains so bad, and I observed him taking squares of toilet paper and putting toothpaste in them and rolling them up and swallowing those. And he said, "Here, try this. This helps with the hunger." And it did help with the hunger. It settled my stomach down. It sure didn't taste very well, but it did help with the hunger. And that's what we did in between meals. We would do that. I did that for weeks.
So Rob, of course, was a pretrial detainee at the jail, and that was some of his testimony about the food conditions. Our next named plaintiff is Stephanie Rudiger. She's 27 years old. In addition to having a diagnosed mental illness and needing mental health medication that was denied to her at the jail, she also had some experiences with the filth that Brandon mentioned at the jail when it came to the cleanliness or the lack thereof of how the jail was kept. Things such as black mold and, overflowing toilets and lack of cleaning supplies and things like that. But in addition to that, she also talked about the impediments that she and other women in the jail experienced when it came to being able to tend to their personal hygiene. And I would like to let you listen to her testimony on that.
I was there for 2 years, from March 5th, 2017 to March 3rd, 2019. And at any given time, you never knew what to expect as far as taking a shower or even going to the bathroom. One of the biggest issues was the scalding hot water, and it was terrible. It was almost like we were being tortured. And we had saved water bottles from the soda on commissary, and we would fill them up with cold water from our sinks, and we would bring them to the shower with us because we knew as soon as we pressed that shower button, scalding hot water was going to come out. I remember experiencing so many burns, and my skin was just red for so long, and it's almost like you didn't want to take a shower, and that itself is inhumane, especially as a woman, to not want to keep up with your personal hygiene because of the extreme hot temperatures of the shower. We would have girls standing in the corner of the showers, and we would be yelling out, "Can someone get more cold water? Can you please pour it over the shower curtain?" And, we're all women, and we've all seen, what we all have the same body parts, but still it's sort of a little violating to even have somebody you don't even know stand by the shower and pour cold water on you just so you can get clean. And it's just ridiculous. It was to the point where, people were using the hot water to boil our noodles. We were using that hot water to make our coffee. We were using that hot water to essentially just cook our food because that's how hot it was. And our microwave would be broken sometimes, or we would have people in line waiting to use it. And some of us would just go to the shower and get the water. I mean, that's how hot it was. And it was like that essentially almost the entire time I was there, because we would confront many different officers about the issue, and sometimes we wouldn't even get a response.
And so now you've heard from our plaintiffs, one who could tell us about the lack of food, the violence that he experienced, even some of the dental hygiene that he was denied and dental health care that he was denied. Another one of our plaintiffs did not get her mental health medication. She had to deal with the filthy conditions and the scalding hot water, impediments to her personal hygiene. That also was something that the men experienced. And our third named plaintiff is Sean Meesey. He is currently incarcerated at Potosi with the Missouri Department of Corrections, but he is a 31-year-old man who's been disabled since birth. And he was being held pre-trial as well at St. Francis County Jail, where he was being denied even his medical devices for his foot that has been required since he was born in order for him to be able to walk and move about. And so we have spotted these issues of inadequate medical care, deliberate indifference to medical needs, even cruel and unusual punishment, as evidenced by the jail conditions and the way that people are treated. And so on the next slide, you'll hear from our local counsel, Ms. Vaughn Carricker, who is an attorney in Farmington, Missouri. She was the attorney on the Billy Ames case that was previously mentioned. Billy Ames was strapped to that restraint chair while he was overdosing. He was having withdrawals from drugs, and they left him there, and they listened to him scream and cry for hours until he died in that restraint chair. And Vaughn was the attorney litigating that case and just successfully litigated that earlier this year. And she actually people were lifting up their stories about the horrors in St. Francis County Jail to Vaughn as the local attorney there. And that's how this came to our radar here at Arch City. And we have partnered with Vaughn to address these horrors. And so we can hear from her now.
I talked to a guy a week or two ago who said that the deputies put him in the restraint chair, put his relative in the restraint chair and maced them in the mouth. It's weird what happens to people when they have no power and then they suddenly get power. And there's this whole dichotomy of, I think it's a class distinction. They think they're better, is what it looks like to me. They think they're better than these people, and they think these people are no better than animals. But I guarantee you, all of these people have a son, a daughter, a pet, a mom they love and treat with respect. They would never treat anybody or any creature on the outside the way they treat these pre-trial detainees on the inside. It's brutal. And Friday night fights, I've heard from plenty of people about Friday night fights. The deputies get together and they point to someone and say, you fight. And they take bets on the winner.
And so as these different stories and tales were being lifted up to us, of course, sometimes things like this, it can sound a little bit like a conspiracy theory. Like maybe certainly these types of things cannot be happening in our communities or, anywhere near us, but they are in fact happening. And as our city defenders, we do care about these issues that impact poor communities and people of color, especially. And we care about how people's lives are being impacted by the criminal justice system. And so when these things were lifted up to us, we decided to file a litigation, Hopple et al. Versus St. Francis County, Missouri et al. We have, as I mentioned, those 3 named plaintiffs for our class, as well as several defendants that we have filed this litigation against. The county itself, the county sheriff who runs the jail administrator, the licensed practical nurse who works for St. Francis County, as well as the healthcare contractor, Advanced Correctional Healthcare. We have brought 9 different claims, all under Section 1983, by way of Section 1983, under the 14th Amendment, the 4th Amendment, the ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act. As I mentioned, we have alleged things like cruel and unusual punishment, deliberate indifference, and discrimination against disabled detainees. This is a major issue given that these folks are presumably innocent per the law. The law says that you are innocent until you're proven guilty. And so when you're housing people prior to conviction and they're still being treated in this way, that is something that we feel very strongly about. And so we are alleging that these defendants systemically and knowingly denied minimum necessities to individuals confined at their jail by subjecting them to appalling conditions, being deliberately indifferent to their medical, mental health, and dental needs, and discriminating against and failing to provide reasonable accommodations to the detainees with disabilities. Now, Arch City Defenders, of course, we are situated in the St. Louis area, but our mission goes far beyond just the St. Louis metropolitan area. However, we would not be able to make an impact in other communities without the partnership with local heroes and other co-counsel. Vaughn, who you just heard from, again, is a lawyer in Farmington, Missouri. She is a partner specializing in elder law. She owns her own firm. And she is the leader of the local resistance in St. Francis County. She has kind of risen as a hero in her hometown for vigilantly and zealously litigating these issues. And so Vaughn brings to us a wealth of institutional knowledge and resources and contacts and stories. And we bring our manpower and resources and, partner with her, and each of us use our expertise in these areas to make an impact on this issue and to litigate these issues in the St. Francis County area. In addition to Arch City and Vaughn, we're also partnering with the Simon Law Firm and Coliani LLC to litigate this case.
Hey everyone, I'm going to take it over from here. My name's Lee Camp, and I want to tell you about, I'm an attorney here in the lead counsel on Ritchie versus St. Clair County. And I want to tell you a little bit about a modern day debtors prison that's happening and running on the western side of Missouri. This case takes place, of course, in St. Clair County, which you can see is down this red dot in Southwest Missouri. And you can see Mr. Ritchie, his name's George right here. This is one of our colleagues interviewing him in the detention facility there. And we're going to talk about George's story first, because it's really important that we understand who George is and the fight that he has put up to really combat these aggressive practices of collecting debt from poor people and jailing people in St. Clair County. Again, something that we know is happening all throughout Missouri. So who is George? Well, here's another picture of George. He is an honorably discharged Air Force veteran. He's a grandfather, and he's also an individual that has been repeatedly incarcerated for being poor. Multiple times, really since 2015, that he was placed in jail for not being able to pay court debt. And what I haven't mentioned yet is that more than anything, George is a fighter, and he stands up when he knows something is wrong. And I think that really that fight culminated in something that has changed the kind of landscape in the way that we think about debtors' prisons in Missouri, going back to 2019, when George actually fought all the way to our state's high court and was able to win a case with the help of the Missouri Public Defender System and challenged this practice of putting people in jail for failing to pay jail debts. In Missouri, if you are jailed prior to this decision, you could actually be charged and taxed essentially for being jailed. Every day that you spend in jail, the bill goes up. And that's what happened to George. As a poor person, back in June of 2015, he was found guilty of a misdemeanor, sentenced to jail at that time, or actually he wasn't sentenced to jail at that time, he was incarcerated pre-trial. But that pre-trial incarceration, after that sentence was handed down, he was hit with a $3,300 bill for sitting in jail. You know, something that he couldn't pay. George's sole source of income to this day is Social Security insurance because he has a disability. And so he's hit with this large bill. He's making about $600 a month. And of course, it's hard for him to pay that off. And so he tells the judge this, and the judge says, well, you're going to pay me something. You know, this is going back to 2015. And finally, there came a day in February of 2016 that he couldn't pay anymore. He didn't have the money and knew that he wouldn't be able to make a payment. And so what George did is the judge had compelled that he come back to court anytime that he couldn't make a payment, and he had to explain to the court why he couldn't. Well, George didn't have a car, and he lived about 25 miles from the courthouse in Osceola, Missouri, in St. Clair County. And so he literally walked to court back and forth when he couldn't make payments on these hearings. And again, in February of 2016, when he couldn't make a payment, he was jailed again. And then starts the cycle of, you know, rinse, wash, repeat. Jailed again, the bill goes up, he comes out of court with even more debt. This poor person that couldn't pay court costs, essentially, at the time he was being charged with court costs for being incarcerated and a litany of other what we call legal financial obligations. Anyone that has interacted with the court system knows there are all kinds of fees and different things that usually a defendant in a criminal case like this would be hit with. That bill just continued to rise. And George did, you know, when he finally got out of jail that time, he still had to make these walks. You know, when he couldn't get a ride, he would walk back to the courthouse, and for years went through this process until November of 2018. So the story starts in June of 2015, gets to November of 2018, and he finally challenges it, again, with the help of the public defender system, to say, I'm literally being incarcerated because I'm poor. I'm too poor to pay debt at this time. And as a fighter, he didn't stop when the trial judge said, you're wrong. He fought this case to the state's high court, and the court agreed with it. They said, you cannot jail people because they can't pay court debt in our state. So really, this was a groundbreaking decision that has helped countless individuals around the state. And you would think, okay, well, this has to be the end of the fight, right? I mean, he's got this great decision that says he can't be jailed for not paying this money. So what else could happen? Well, since he won that case, Mr. Ritchie has been harassed continually by St. Clair County. And so in February of 2021, after Mr. Ritchie again was released from the local jail in St. Clair, he brought a suit in federal court to challenge debt collection practices at this time. So we have to take a step back, and what the court said is you can't be incarcerated over this jail debt, but the county and these different actors acting on behalf of the county and the state, really, they can try to collect this debt just as civil debt. So the same way, any of us that maybe have missed a bill, or particularly like a hospital bill, something like that, the debt collection company comes into play, and they send you notice after notice, and then they try to, potentially garnish your wages. Well, St. Clair County, knowing that, they couldn't incarcerate him anymore, began to try to collect from him through a third-party debt collection company, a company down in Texas, has no relation to Missouri. And this was all happening at the hands of the circuit clerk at the court in St. Clair County, the sheriff in St. Clair County, and really as a practice of the county itself. And so what Mr. Ritchie did is he sued these entities to say, yeah, I acknowledging, sure, you can say that I owe this debt, but I've told you multiple times, you're on notice, that my sole source of income is Social Security. And one thing that maybe people on this call tonight don't know, but Social Security payments, that's a safety net, right? It is to ensure that the most vulnerable amongst us have some money to live off of. It's often inadequate, but that's the design of the policy. And with that being the design, the idea is that that is money that cannot be touched by anyone. It can't be garnished against. It can't be levied by the state or a private actor. And exactly what we see happening here is harassment at the hands of a municipal entity and a court clerk and a sheriff to come after those Social Security payments, his sole source of income that he's receiving. And so here we go again. Mr. Ritchie has retained us, Arch City Defenders. We're working with two outstanding co-counsel, a firm named Gupta Wessler, who's located in Washington, D.C., and a firm named Terrell Marshall in Washington State, to challenge this very practice. While he is not at a threat of being incarcerated at this moment related to not paying this debt, we know that debt wreaks absolute economic hardship on people like Mr. Ritchie. And really, he will tell his story better, and I'll let you hear from him as well. But to kind of wrap up what this litigation looks like, we've sued the county. Again, we've sued the county, the sheriff, the court clerk, and the debt collection company for a violation of 1983, for violating Section 407 of the US Code, which is the Social Security Act. We've also sued them for violating the US Constitution, where federal law trumps the state law in this area, and federal law says you cannot garnish Social Security payments or even attempt to collect those. And we know that there have been multiple attempts at this point to collect against Mr. Ritchie's very limited Social Security. And then we brought a federal preemption claim somewhat related to the Supremacy Clause, but stating that the way that Missouri law stands right now is preempted under or by 1983 is violating federal law. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is in the state of Missouri, the court clerk is compelled to attempt to collect this debt. And so that is really what we're trying to change through Mr. Ritchie's case, and he is trying to change is a pattern and practice of collecting court debts, jail board bills particularly, from individuals through collection means throughout the state if they're receiving Social Security. Again, I think Mr. Ritchie really, this is his quote here, he sums it up. For people like him, it's like shoveling snow in a blizzard. The problems continue to come for people that are harassed, poor people particularly. And I've been here at Arch City for a little over 4 years now. And one thing that we frequently talk about is how we see predatory practices recalibrate against poor people. We see, legislative changes happen. We'll see litigation maybe change the way that a court has to operate, or a local government has to operate, or even the state of Missouri has to operate. But we know very frequently and quickly those same entities will recalibrate and find new ways to harass poor people. And what we saw here in Mr. Ritchie's case, just 5 months after he got that landmark decision from the Missouri Supreme Court, the debt collector shows up at his door trying to collect money against him. It only took 5 months. You would think maybe for a moment, this individual who's, you know, taking you through all this litigation, taking you up to the court and said, you know, got a court decision that said your practices were wrong, you might leave him alone. Well, we just know that's not the case. We've seen it in local municipalities in St. Louis. We were talking to the public defenders about George at that time, and sure enough, 5 months later, these same practices to harass him continue. And so he's not, you know, he's not done fighting. He's doing this again to try to help individuals all over the state of Missouri. And we are optimistic that we will, you know, prevail in this fight and will continue to fight for Mr. Ritchie. Now, I can tell you all about his experiences, but I think that it's really important to hear from him. And so I'm going to play a couple clips here. Will note the audio is not great on these, but there are closed captions. This is Mr. Ritchie talking about what he wants his life to be and the hell that he went through dealing with St. Clair County and what he really thinks about the practices that are occurring in that county now.
In a year, you know, I want to get back to being, you know, with my family, being a grandpa. I just want to teach people to leave me alone. I just want them to get off my back and let me get on with my life. That judge needs to be held accountable. The scales of justice don't work. You know, they're not very balanced. He doesn't know what I've lost. I've lost all my clothes. I've lost everything. I'm rebuilding from the bottom up. And I don't, you know, that's stressful enough. I'd go to a court hearing, and it was, if I had the money, I'd go up there, pay the money, you know, cha-ching, and I would get it was almost like a get out of jail free card. But if I had that receipt, I knew when I went in front of Relihan, you know, he was going to give me another month, you know, to pay some more money. If I didn't make a payment, I couldn't. I knew I was hammered. And between the jail time, the money I've spent, and everything else, I'm being punished for being poor. Well, as far as St. Clair County, I would describe it as greed-based, and it's the lower income people that, you know, they don't stand a chance. If you go in there with a high dollar attorney, you're gonna fare, you know, you're gonna fare a lot better. But it's greed, or vindictive, or greed, or whatever, because it doesn't, on my end, it doesn't make sense. You know, you look back on my original case, it was, if I was in Kansas City, if I was in St. Louis, I would have got fined and kicked out the door in court. But they put a saddle on me and rode me for, you know, 5.5 years. And I'm tired of it.
So from here, I want to kick it over to Brandon again to lead a little bit of a discussion on where we see this work going, and to talk about, you know, the future of debtors' prisons. We're already seeing them recalibrate in cases like Mr. Ritchie's, but I'm going to kick it to Brandon to talk about, you know, what we're seeing and what we could use to really do this work moving forward.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Katrina. Two very informative presentations about cases whether facts are different. In St. Francis, we have a group of people who are living in what we have alleged are inhumane conditions, primarily because many of them are too poor to bail out of jail. Whereas in Ritchie, you have a veteran who's having all of his funds, that Social Security safety net, extracted or stolen from him by the state. And I think Lee was right to point out that this system historically has always recalibrated itself. Here we see in this picture a historic picture of what the original debtors prison kind of looked like. Over 100 years later, we see in Ferguson this what we have termed a debtors prison scheme, where the state or the municipality, preyed upon the citizens in the form of excessive ticketing and warrants. And so, this begs the question, what is the future of debtors prison cases look like both in Missouri and nationwide? I'm going to ask my colleagues to come on now as we begin to talk about this, and also welcome comments and questions in the chat. We did see that there were some questions in the chat, and so we will get to those. Just waiting for Katrina and Jackie to hop on here. But, in terms of next steps, where do we see debtors prisons going? For me, I am beginning to look at debt as a carceral instrument, and I am looking at the various ways in which these legal financial obligations serve as a means of extracting wealth from people and using the power of the state and jailing to do that, right? And so that happens in various forms. When we started the conversation, I tried to contextualize this as Ritchie and St. Francis taking place within the context of jails. But there is also, we believe, some financial exploitation within the prison system, right? And so we don't have to get into that now, but I think that the future of debtors prison ideas could be expanded to looking into the ways in which prisoners are exploited after conviction. I also think that, there is a rise in what is being called incarceration, which shows up as electronic monitoring or forms of probation that require someone who is detained, so to speak, by that technology to have to pay or check in, so to speak, and pay excessive fees. And so, Lee, I think that you were right to kind of talk about the ways in which this debtors prison context has recalibrated and continues to recalibrate itself. For you, though, I am interested in, when we think about a debtor's prison, we think about someone, being in jail because they could not pay a debt. For Ritchie, his case had to do with debts, jail debts for being in jail. But can you explain a little about the ways in which, Ritchie or Mr. Ritchie not having access to financial resources really made him particularly vulnerable to this sort of scheme?
Yeah, it's a good question, particularly because I think there's this idea that we would have been, right, the ones that would have been at the Supreme Court challenging the incarceration, and maybe our work doesn't go that far. Well, I think like a unique thing about the way that we practice law here and the way that we investigate things, it's very community informed, but it's also creative to a degree, right? I mean, we are looking at ways that people are being punished across the board. And to your point, in the background you just gave there, And to the discussion that we had earlier today, we talk about these things frequently at the office. There's economic justice too. And now we're seeing, an individual, as he said, right, for 5.5 years. And it is no lie. I mean, the court records reflected he was in and out of the courts simply for being poor. And, working on this, I just can't help but think, that just had to be enough, but it wasn't. It wasn't enough. And now by using a debt collector, I use that hospital analogy because I think that it's something that we've gone through, right? I know I've gone through that. I've got the collection statement for not paying off a bill from an urgent care or whatever. And it's so relatable. Imagine getting that after being incarcerated time and time again and having to go through everything he's gone through. And then imagine that your only source of income is less than $700 a month. That's to live on. That's to buy your food, to pay for your housing. We've mentioned transportation, unreliable to the point he was walking 50 miles to make some of these different hearings that he was ordered to be at. It's harassment, and it is running his life. I'm grateful that he stepped up. I'm honored to work on this case for Mr. Ritchie. My background is not in this area of practice, and it's been so fascinating to work on it and to really start to untangle. This is a tricky legal issue that we're litigating around, but it's so important. And it's right under our nose. That's the thing. It's just bills going to him, but it's all at the hands of the state and the municipality in St. Clair and the sheriff there. And I think there are so many instances where these things are happening time and time again that maybe we don't necessarily think, oh, they're not predatory. This is just the way things are. Well, maybe that's wrong. And, we want to look into those things. And, we're doing that for George here. And again, we hope to prevail here and stop this practice that he is uplifted and that we found out about. We hope to stop it throughout the state, really. You're muted, Brandon.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think there's so much to unpack there. So thank you for that. As we begin to wrap up, I want to make sure to answer any questions that we have. I want to give folks an opportunity to, pose any questions to us that we may have in the chat, while we just give folks an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. If you don't mind telling me a little bit about how we connected with co-counsel in your case. You mentioned working with a firm out of DC and out of Washington State. You mind just telling us a little bit about how that came to be and how that works on behalf of clients?
Sure. I'm not perfectly poised to answer this question. Maybe Jackie can jump in a little, but we have worked with we work with firms, around the country. They know our work. Our work really was groundbreaking in the debtors prison arena. And we're lucky for that. We've been able to help a lot of people, and, it's interesting work for lawyers, and it is work that is important. And so I think that people want to work with us on these issues. We are, the way that Arch City, anyone that's on here that's heard kind of our speech about this before, it's really true. We're boots on the ground first. We represent people at the core of our mission here, and that is being in the courts with people that are going through these issues and working, alongside people like the public defenders. And we hear the issues that are going on, and we believe our clients, we believe our neighbors, our fellow Missourians in this case, and we listen to those issues and then we try to address them. It's a unique model that puts a lot of issues on our radar. Certainly, anyone watching that thinks, oh, I've got something similar going on in my community, or I've talked to my cousin out in Osceola, this is happening to them too. We want to hear about that. We can only do the work when it is lifted up from the community itself, if it's done properly. So I think that's unique, and that brings us into looking at interesting issues. And, you know, Gupta Wessler is a highly respected firm out of DC that works on issues like this. I mentioned that it's a pretty complicated legal issue. They litigate constitutional stuff all the time. And then Terrell Marshall in Washington State, they've actually looked at this issue in a few places around the country. So it was kind of a perfect fit between all three of us to work together on this.
I can also kind of speak to kind of piggybacking on what Lee said. I think it's important. Sorry, I just realized my video is off. I think it's important also to know that we have a close working relationship with the Missouri Public Defender System, the Missouri State Public Defender, and we are in conversation with them, and we get feedback from them about the things that they're seeing in the courts, the issues that they think need to be addressed, what they want to lift up. And a lot of these issues came out of conversations we had with them where they said, you know, you brought this case in this jurisdiction, that's happening in our jurisdiction. And so we are having conversations about strategy. And so it's just it's an essential next step in the work that we do, that we would expand this to the rural areas. There are not attorneys. Sorry, I have a dog barking. There are not attorneys practicing these cases as large, not litigating large cases like we are in rural Missouri. And so that's one of the reasons why we're expanding outstate.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Katrina. We also have a paralegal from our team, Teresa, who's just so essential in the work that we do, you know, connecting with clients and making sure that we maintain connection with them across the state. And so, you know, I just want to thank the entire team. You know, I think Lee said it best. If you know, out there in the public, if you know of issues in communities that we are not presently in, but that perhaps maybe we should be investigating, Lee's going to go to the next slide, which has our contact information. Feel free to, you know, reach out to us, have a conversation with us, because you would be surprised to know that many of the issues we end up litigating starts with the conversation between us and someone who maybe thinks that they've been harmed, or a loved one has been harmed or taken advantage of. And so, you know, we welcome those conversations. That is why we exist. We want to, you know, make this work more accessible throughout this state. But we also want to highlight people throughout the state, whether they be lawyers or organizers, who are also doing this work. Kind of, you know, as we saw with the St. Francis case, there was already someone, you know, boots on the ground, so to speak. And so, you know, even if you wanted to reach out to us to let us know if there are other folks who you think are doing similar work, who we can work with. So again, thank you for everyone who, you know, showed up to listen to this talk. We hope that you found it informative, and we look forward to ways of continuing to build community and learning with you in the future. Again, my name is Brandon Jackson. I'm a staff attorney with Arch City Defenders, and on behalf of the entire Special Projects team, we thank you and wish you the best.